Hello, and welcome to Inside the Avatar Studio. Inside the Avatar Studio brings together innovative leaders from the virtual technology frontier to discuss their perceptions, perspectives, and predictions of what being virtual means in today's society. I'm your host, Kevin Feenan, and with me today is Doug Thomas, known more popularly in Second Life as Dusan Writer. Dusan has over 20 years of brand strategy, market research, advertising, and digital media experience. As CEO of Remedy Communications and a founding partner at Startled Cat, Dusan has presented at conferences throughout North America on virtual worlds and the impact of technology on business and culture. Dusan, thank you, and thank you for being on the program.
It's great to be here, and welcome to a new fall semester.
Exactly. You get to be our premier host right at the beginning here.
Usually the first day of class is the most disorganized one, so my thoughts hopefully will be a little more concise.
No. The more disorganized, the better. The more tangents we get off onto, the better off we're doing here. It was interesting because as soon as Bevan told me that you had agreed to come on board and do the program with us, I'm sitting there going, oh my God, how do I strip down the number of questions that I want to ask? Because I mean, you're such a prolific writer inside the field of virtual worlds, and so hopefully I've got a couple of questions here that'll sort of get the conversation going and get us on some interesting sidetracks. One of which is, I know for a long time that I've been following your adventures on the virtual frontier, and everything that you've done, from your blog to Metanomics to the work that you've been doing on Startled Cat, and the most recent thing, I mean, I've seen a couple of things that have just sort of come my way. I mean, the Marathon for Medical Research, they all seem to have this consistent theme of storytelling as being more than just being art and science in terms of the way that you approach it. And I'm wondering what initially drew you to this, what I can only describe as or at least what comes across as being a passion that seems evident to tell stories in new and interesting ways.
Oh, wow. What a great question. I think when I discovered virtual worlds, I remember presenting at SLCC a couple of years ago and talking about the experience of feeling like I had returned to my childhood, because virtual worlds felt like they were the synthesis of my interest in the combination of technology and story. And this was an interest that I remember having when I was a little kid, when I was like 5 years old. The technology that I would use might have been Lego bricks or boxes and toy cars, but I would play with those. I would play with the Lego and tell myself stories about what the characters or what the toy cars were doing, what the narrative was that they were part of. And I guess I've always felt like I wish that I was a storyteller myself, and so I'm fascinated. I came into Second Life and discovered that the narrative toolkit was as limitless as your imagination, and certainly that was the thing that first drew me into virtual worlds, was that old slogan, which I'll continue to evangelize, that I wish they would bring it back, but is your world your imagination. And that idea that we can not only consume stories, or that we can not only be the reader of a story, but that we can be performers in our own narrative, I think is a powerful. It's a powerful paradigm, and I've come to believe over the several years of being involved in virtual worlds in particular, I've come to believe that paradigm may be one of the things that saves us as humans, and that it gives us a way to respond to some of the negative strains that can happen as we adopt more and more technology. Is that storytelling, the paradigm of digital storytelling, can actually be something that allows us to retain our humanity in the face of technology that is often mechanized and depersonalizing.
Wow, I mean, there's so many thoughts I have around, especially that last little bit in terms of what you're talking about in terms of dehumanizing. Because I mean, as you were saying that, the first image that I sort of had come to my mind is all these conversations that seem to be going on right at the moment that are related to, how do I put this? I mean, oh shoot, what's the fellow's name? Kersner? No, the Wurlitzer guy. The oh shoot, I hate it when I forget.
Kurzweil, you mean? Like the singularity?
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
right,
Kurzweil.
right.
Okay. So he's talking about this evolving brain and the eventuality of computers developing consciousness and what have you. And you're talking about this idea of retaining sort of what it means to be human in the face of growing technology. And yet Kurzweil is talking about going inside that opposite direction. He's talking about machines eventually out-evolving human beings. Right?
Yeah, and that's I think what I mean by the counter narrative, that and counter narrative meaning the counter narrative to a particular view of where technology is heading, and counter narrative also meaning a different paradigm for how we decide to make decisions about technology. And in fact, it's not Kurzweil I always thought. I mean, Kurzweil. There are a lot of people that follow him, and he kind of comes from that group of individuals who were first inspired by the Whole Earth Catalog, and he kind of extended that and said the Whole Earth Catalog kind of made us realize the importance of the tools, and that the tools that we use as humans are one of the things that defines us. And he took that further and said that the tools themselves could eventually become more powerful than we are. I actually had a bit of a crisis of confidence about 6 months ago, and it was precipitated by Kevin Kelly's latest book, which is called What Technology Wants. And it's a kind of gentler version of Kurzweil, and what he proposes is that technology is in fact an organism and a culture of its own, and that it is trying to find a place in the world beside us, that we should look at technology as being this thing that is going to evolve, it's going to grow, regardless of whether we try to stop it or not. It doesn't mean that the particular technologies are a foregone conclusion, but that technology has followed an evolutionary path, and that evolutionary path has taken on its own life. And so he's almost attempting to kind of humanize technology by equating it to being a living organism. And I found that actually kind of frightening, because by trying to create an equivalence between technology and humanity, it felt like there's the possibility that we forget the qualities of humanness that are different from technology. So I've come to believe that this counter-narrative, where we think about elements of our humanity that cannot be captured by technology, are important to value and to celebrate. And I think one of those things is storytelling. So a lot of the discussion in the media will be around things like transmedia, or it will be about gamification. And I think these are interesting approaches for taking something like storytelling and trying to put it into a technology box in which it may have an uneasy accommodation. And so I think that the stories that we tell about storytelling are important ways for us to grapple with the place that technology can hold in supporting our humanness.
So there's a concept that I remember somebody telling me about way long ago. So far back, I'm not going to admit how old I am on it. That in any particular type of storytelling, there's only ever 7 real themes that people ever tell stories around, and that all stories are based around these 7 themes, and they never did, unfortunately, really sort of elaborate around it, but. Does that not, in a way, sort of limit, right? Assuming that there is some truth to this, that there is a finite number of stories, and that we're just sort of reinterpreting the same things over and over again, is there not then a limit to which our capacity to storytelling can potentially go without the involvement of technology to drive new directions and new ways of I guess, sort of experiencing the universe, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm just dropping a link in chat actually, which is an article today in Fast Company Design, and it was about a new iPad app that can generate an infinite number of bedtime stories. It's called the Infinite Adventure Machine, and it was based on some earlier work by a Russian researcher who and I'm going to kind of quote here, who reduced the structure of Russian folktales to 31 narratives, kind of like the building blocks of storytelling. So you could take those 31 building blocks of storytelling and you can reconfigure them in a nearly infinite number of tales. But to me, the issue is not the issue is not so much that there are a limited number of potential narrative structures. And I think if you look back on something like Joseph Campbell's work, and then the later work of Carl Jung on archetypes, or the earlier work of Carl Jung on archetypes, which was picked up by Joseph Campbell, and the idea of the hero with 1,000 faces, is that there are probably a limited number of archetypes or a limited number of story structures that we are responsive to. But the devil is in the details. And I think it's in the details that fall within those narrative structures and the way that those narrative structures are delivered. In other words, is it delivered as a television show or is it delivered in a virtual world? And I think one of the breakthroughs that virtual worlds have brought to us, and I wrote a post about this several years ago, was that sense of returning to a campfire. Because it's not, what happened around a campfire was that you repeated the same myths over and over again. The important thing wasn't the fact that the myth was repeated. The important thing was how we as a community reacted to those myths and our ability to participate and contribute to those narratives. And isn't that what Second Life really is? There may be a limited number of narrative structures that play out in Second Life, and yet in the details, we have created this world, or we have created the worlds on OpenSim, or we are creating the stories that appear in Unity. And so I think it's the important thing that we're discovering is that we still honor our individual response and ability to participate in stories. And so long as we continue to honor that, there is a way to accommodate our humanness to the emergence of technologies that can often be depersonalizing.
Right. It's interesting that the campfire analogy that you're using, because I mean, one of the, and this is something it doesn't keep me awake at night, but certainly it has woken me up on a couple of occasions. Because all the best and really warped ideas come to you at 3:00 in the morning. When we talk about stories, when we talk about campfire and the participatory experience, I mean, it's an experience shared, seems to have more depth to it. But if you look at the, especially with inside Native American culture, prior to the introduction of Europeans, I mean, there was a very rich oral history that was essentially passed down from generation to generation, essentially around a campfire, and to a certain extent, I mean, like I wonder about this about technology in general, but I mean, if we extend the metaphor into virtual worlds and Second Life and OpenSim and other environments like this, is it really allowing us to recapture some of the things that we've potentially lost as a society to be able to retain and transfer knowledge through a potential oral history, or have we now lost that capability because of an over-reliance upon the technology?
That's what I'll kind of circle back to the idea of the common narrative and the counter narrative, and I would say that the common narrative would tell us that we have become that we are consumers of stories, although that's although they would say that that's mitigated by the ability of people to post on YouTube or whatever. Okay, so there's this one narrative, and the one narrative says that, I'm telling stories because I'm posting photos on Facebook of a party I was at, and that's my way of sharing the story of that party rather than standing around the water cooler. But the reality is that there are also digital spaces, and I think that we're in one right now, where the tool set of being able to speak around the campfire is so rich that, in fact, I think that it's reminding us of our capacity to carry on that oral tradition. One of the things I actually think is a positive virtue of virtual worlds is that they still remain fairly ephemeral. In other words, the build that was here 2 months ago has been replaced or has disappeared. And the fact that it's disappeared, I think, is beneficial because it helps to contribute to the way that we remember and the way that we share stories about what's happened to us in these spaces. I'm a big believer that, what we learn going into virtual spaces and what we learn becoming an avatar, those tools, those skills that we learn in a virtual world, that we bring them out with us into the real world. And certainly I can say that that's true of my own experience. Things that I've learned in Second Life had a profound impact on how I engage with my communities, how I think about my work, how I structure the way that work gets produced. And so I think that same truth can hold, that you participate in a virtual experience. It could be a game-like experience, it could be an MMO, it could be Second Life. And what you take out of those experiences are skills that you can apply in the real world. For those of us who have been in virtual worlds and who have learned to, res a prim, I actually think there becomes this sort of richness in how we look at the world around us, because we start realizing that the real world itself is constructed by other people, that it's a shared artifact. And hopefully more and more we start to honor what we've learned in virtual worlds and bring it into the real.
There was a I'm just trying to see if I can find it here. I'm actually going to have to come back. Well, actually, no. I think I just did find it. I mean, there was an episode of Metanomics a while back where you had Tyler Cohen on, and you had then, as part of your blog, you had quoted him as saying, from an economic standpoint, we assemble value on our own through our process of creation, but also through the acts of parsing the imaginative acts of others. And that, as a consequence of that, virtual economies are essentially the act of buying little dreams. Right?
I love that phrase. Isn't that beautiful? I love that phrase.
It's interesting. As I'm listening, as I'm looking at that, I'm sort of, because the economist in me is immediately turning around and thinking, there's so much engendered in that, which is sort of this really neat concept, but also counterintuitive. So as a business owner, this idea of dreams being accessible and democratic with multiple distribution channels, from an economic point of view, is it really the dream we're buying, or is it the value proposition that the dream engenders? Right.
What an interesting question. Well, I think he talked about that a little bit on the show, and he talked about how in a virtual world, for example, you make aspirational purchases. So you buy the latest mesh shoes, or you buy the latest mesh avatar, and you're not just buying the value proposition of the fact that this was crafted or that it's made of X number of prims, but you're buying it as an aspirational. You're buying it as an aspirational purchase as well. There's an interesting riff off of that, and I think one of the interesting riffs is that, first of all, Edward Castranova's first book, which I thought was great. I wasn't a big fan of his second one, but Edward Castronova kind of pointed this out in Synthetic Worlds, didn't he? Where he was talking about what's happening is that economic value, as currently captured in economics, is disappearing as people spend more and more of their time in alternate realities. And he proposed and has recently picked that up through some analysis that they were doing of people in Second Life and their sense of happiness in virtual worlds. He picked that up to say that this could have an impact on the overall economy. Because if I'm paying attention to my avatar, if I'm paying attention to my character in World of Warcraft, then I'm not paying attention to something else. And so the idea that economies would shift into virtuality, I don't think that anybody could argue that that truly has happened. And whether it's Farmville or Mafia Wars or being in Second Life and buying Prim shoes. But what I think's interesting about that, if you take a kind of longer view of history, is I think that the notions that we explore in virtual worlds value has not just moved to virtual worlds, but the things that we explore economically in virtual worlds, I think will start to have an impact on how we view economies in general. And one of the things I mean by that, and Tyler Cohen pointed this out, was that we are now creating our own economy. Because if you talk about the value proposition, it used to be that value was placed and embedded in physical objects, and now it's increasingly embedded in digital objects. So you can create your own economy. You can say that of my time, which is of my time and money, I choose to invest that in things that aren't necessarily traditionally captured in economic models. Think about the concept for a second of how the Second Life economy works, and the idea that there are limits placed in that economy. So it's scarcity, and those limits are placed in the concept of land. And yet in the real world, we don't place economic value in the environment. You don't find the consequence of carbon emissions showing up on some company's profit and loss or balance sheet. And yet in virtual worlds, we're exploring ideas like that, where we acknowledge the limits of the spaces that we're in, and we are attaching economic value. We're creating economic models where that value is articulated. So I think over time, these economic models that seem like kind of fantasy in virtual worlds will start to become an inspiration for how we develop new economic models that recognize that attention, what we do to our environment, the value of social connection, that these things which are not traditionally measured in economic models perhaps should be.
Okay, so as part of a counter argument to a certain extent, I mean, it's one thing. To a certain extent, it's one thing to buy the dream. It's one thing to buy into inside a virtual environment these additional sort of non-tangible things that we place value on. But it's a completely another thing to have people open up their wallets and say, "I'm willing to pay for it." And one of the things that we see certainly inside virtual world, I mean, we see this inside the Web 2D space, 2.0 space as well, is in terms of, we've gone so. I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad thing, but I mean, we've gone so far down this open source model that there appears to be this sense of entitlement to everything and anything being provided at an enterprise class level and being provided either as cheap as possible or being provided free of charge. And so when you've got people that actually have to pay their mortgages each month or their rent or whatever it is that they're doing, are these two things potentially mutually exclusive? I mean, are we headed to a clash between those two aspects down the road?
Well, okay. So, first, I think it's a myth that the concept of open source and everything is copyable means that everything will be copyable. And I think we already see that with the way that Apple, yes, Apple is a closed system, and yet they've proven that you can have closed systems within larger open systems that have an economic model where not everything is copyable. Not everything is just because it's digital doesn't mean that it becomes free. So I think that there are as many, there's as many business models and there are as many systems as and the only limit to those systems really is our imagination. But I guess the second thing is that I think we've seen this in virtual worlds, and I think one of the challenges with Linden Lab has always been that they provide you with tools in order to create content, and because things don't decay, at some point that content becomes commodified. It becomes the thing that's in the freebie burn, whether there's copy bought or not. At some point, the shoes that I make, there's so many pairs of shoes on the grid that I can practically give it away for free because I want them to now buy my sculpted, my sculpty shoes. So things, so there's a level of content in digital domains which becomes commodified over time. I would say that the first thing that became commodified was basic information, especially as personified by kind of Google and Yahoo and the rest of them. The next thing that is becoming commodified is our social connections, where those social connections, which used to have kind of deep personal values, have become it's become commodified by how many friends I can attract on Facebook. And so social connections become commodified. The thing right now, I believe, which has not been commodified, is storytelling, and that there is still a market. There is still that people still value the experience of participating in or consuming stories, and that so long as the media for delivering those stories it remains advanced. Like delivering a video, you're still delivering a video online, but delivering a story in a 3D environment is still relatively unique. And people, not everybody, but many people do place value and are willing to pay to participate in those stories. So what comes after? Can stories be commodified? And I think one of the things that we need to resist against is the idea that something which is so basically human, we need to be careful about allowing the tools of storytelling to become easily commodified as information has been. But then I guess the last point I would sort of like to make, and looking kind of into deeper future stuff, is that as digital technology has an increasing impact on our physical world, I think that paradigm will change again. Right now, this idea that everything that's digital can become commodified and easy to copy. I think what's going to happen is we'll start to see the ability of what we do in a digital world to have a direct impact on the physical world around us. And when I think of that, I'm thinking about things like 3D printing, new models for how manufacturing and collaboration happens, how fashion is designed, crafted, produced, and distributed. That's the next frontier, is that as we start to work in digital spaces, I actually think that you'll see the physical world around us changing. And when you start crossing that boundary from the digital back to the analog, I think it's going to create a different paradigm, and that looking back to the days when we worried about everything being copyable, will look old-fashioned when we look back on that.
Okay, so here's the loaded question then. If because I fully agree with you. I mean, this is one of the things that I've been saying here at Rockcliffe for many years, is that we have a good understanding of the benefits and the limitations of taking stuff from the real world and making it virtual. What we don't have a good understanding of is how we take things that we've developed and knowledge that we've developed inside a virtual world and make it real. But I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, the type of change that you're talking about is the type of change that, oh God, okay, I'm going to have to admit that I'm old. The type of change that you're talking about is the type of change that our children are the ones that are really going to be driving that as we grow as a society. But yet, when we look at the demographics with inside environments like Second Life and with inside OpenSim, which are, to me, the most dynamic of the environments that these lessons are sort of coming out of. I mean, you're looking at the mid-30s, early 40 type demographic of people who are either settled in their careers or they have no career, one or the other. And you know, it's not the college age students that are sort of coming in here and sort of driving a lot of this particular stuff. It's those people that can afford the computer systems and the high bandwidth required in order to be online here.
Yeah, so, I think that's partly true. Although the lab would disagree, I think they would say that the demographic is actually trending quite a bit younger right now, and that one of their fastest growing age groups is the 16 to 20-year-olds or whatever. But I think, but if you actually look at how kids are spending their time, aside from updating their Facebook profiles and all the rest of it, you know, there's a huge modding community that's taking some of the kind of popular Xbox type titles, and they're creating incredibly elaborate levels, and they're creating their own narratives, they're creating their own stories based on those levels. You look at the type of stuff like Minecraft as an example. I actually think that the younger, I mean, maybe I'm just kind of an optimist, but I like to give the younger generation credit for probably being able to hack into, find, use, be attracted to all kinds of different tools that, you know, they might be out there at the fringes. It might be creating a level using Unreal, or it might be taking the Fallout game and creating your own level within Fallout. So I'm not going to give up hope yet. Second Life itself, I think, has a challenge, because I kind of sense you're sort of circling around this a little bit, but there's this challenge that right now some of the richest tools available to us are also some of the most expensive, and I do feel there's a lag between that the cost of being able to use these tools coming down so that it has has a wider mass appeal, because I do think there's something really unique. And as you say, there's something very unique in Second Life and OpenSim, and the more we can engage younger people in taking advantage of these tools and showing us what they can come up with, the better. It's interesting though, because we've actually launched an initiative called the Brainpower Initiative, and I just want to touch on that a little bit. And the Brainpower Initiative was formed, and it's a consortium of universities and teachers and industry people. And it was formed to look at the way that kids are interacting with technology, and then specifically to look at the impact of that technology on brain function. So we're working with neuroscientists to develop games that aren't just engaging for a child, but that can actually have a positive cognitive benefit. And I think that that's really important, to be doing that kind of work where technology isn't just shown as being an entertainment platform, but that it's entertaining and can have, very, very real, concrete, innovative, leading-edge outcomes, like I can actually increase the IQ of a child, or I can increase their attention span. And the evidence for that kind of work and the sort of innovation that's happening in that crossover between what happens in the lab and what happens at the blackboard is going to be, it's going to be something really interesting to watch, I think, over the next year, as we start to see video game titles that weren't just designed to sell, and they weren't just designed to get somebody to play it for a long time, but was that was designed purposefully to, improve that the way that the brain can handle, process information, and be receptive to other forms of learning.
Do we not have the potential that within that, and it
is there a danger? Is there a flip side danger?
Well, I mean, my apologies. My brain sometimes goes faster than my mouth. This whole concept in terms of a loss of innocence, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, we have all these people. I mean, we had these things like 10 years ago where people were told, play Mozart to your kid while he's still in the womb, or, when they're, 6 months old, start showing them flashcards about different languages, and they'll be smarter when they grow older. And after 15, 20 years of research, what they discovered is that the effective learning path, it didn't matter really what you did to kids, at that early stage of development. By the time that they were the age of 6 years old, they all basically got to the same point, whether the parents did all this stuff or whether they didn't. And I'm wondering, to a certain extent, are we not extending that a little bit by saying, that it is, that children have to be smarter at an earlier age? Are we then not, in some ways, getting them to lose their innocence and their ability to be children?
Well, isn't there a lot of, you would know this better than I, but I've been following the education community, and there's a lot of debate right now over the value of play, and making sure that schools recognize that just because they're superiors, or just because the system is looking for certain ways of testing children's progress, that if you set aside the concept of just play, then you won't be able to make that kind of progress. And one of the most interesting debates, I think, that's happening in the kind of crossover between neurology and psychology and education and early childhood development, I think one of the most interesting debates is around these concepts of structured interventions versus non-structured, play versus teaching, and very importantly, the difference between brain and mind. And I think that the language that's starting to emerge around understanding the difference between those two is, it's just, if nothing else, it's a fascinating area that has potential. But I also think that it's a topic that we should all approach with some respect for. A child needs to bruise his knee to learn something just as much as they need to participate in a structured activity.
Yeah, when I was running a scout troop, I had a parent that I'd take the kids out for a week-long camping trip, and the kids would come back and they say, "Oh, this was a wonderful trip. We got to climb trees and we got to swing on tires and go out and jump in the lake and do all kinds of stuff." And of course, inevitably you'd get the one mother that would come back and say, "Oh my God, you let my child do such and such. What would happen if he fell out of the tree?"
Right.
But my response was always, "Well, if he breaks his arm, he'll know not to do that twice. Now, won't he?"
Yeah, exactly.
But can't believe the number of mothers that just wanted to throttle me right after I said that.
Well, and I see, Marty and Janai are in the audience, and they're my partners at Startled Cat. And Startled Cat is a studio for immersive storytelling, and part of our mission, part of our belief is that you can't come up with the formula for storytelling, although maybe someday computers will be able to generate those kinds of stories with the level of detail and emotion and character and texture that right now it takes a great storyteller to come up with. So that's one belief, is that there's a place for stories within the domain of technology, and that the presence of those stories within technology can be ennobling, it can change minds, it can change hearts, and it can just be fun. It can be engaging. But the second belief is that there are dangers to technology, and that I would rather be on the right side of history when it comes to our use of technology, and that, yes, I think video games can be harmful to kids. I know it's not the politically correct thing to say, but I just think, like anything, certainly if you overdo it, and I think some games are constructed to addict. Farmville and others are examples of games that were purposefully created to hook you in and keep you. So I'd really like to be on the right side of history, and we may not come up with the magic answer, but to at least be exploring, are there ways to create games for kids that has a direct impact, for example, on their ability to learn? So that's, it's an interesting. I think all of us who have been in virtual worlds have always sort of become, for myself anyway, I've always become more aware of that fine balance that you have between investing so much in your avatar, for example, that you lose yourself, or the deeper, understanding the deep implications of a 3D, fully collaborative, user-generated environment, and then trying to figure out the ways that that applies to the wider world around us. We're always teetering on these sort of interesting contradictions and interesting ambiguities, and I think that's one of the values of participating in virtual worlds.
I'm going to do a little bit of an aside here, just because this sort of feeds back into another couple of questions that I wanted to ask you about. You've been doing a lot of work, and a lot of it seems to be medically based, right? So, taking a look at the Remedy Communications and the website and the case studies that you have up there, I mean, you're doing the medical research stuff, you're working with cancer research groups, you're doing the HIV/AIDS stuff, you're doing the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
Right.
There's a significant portion of what Remedy does with regards to marketing in virtual worlds that is based around this whole idea of medicine. And I'm wondering what it was that you found that sort of attracted you to tackle such, to a certain extent, such hard subjects, and how you feel that the virtual environment is sort of complementing the ability for these organizations to go out and sort of tell their story, because some of these things like HIV/AIDS, even today, this is a very difficult subject for people to talk about sometimes.
Yeah, and I should be pulling up my partners actually for some of that from Startled Cat. Well, the reality is I fell into medicine by accident, and that was where I started my career 20 some years ago, was in the medical field. And so the lowest hanging fruit for me was to translate translate the work that I had been doing on website design or education or branding, to start to try to find ways to translate that into a virtual world. But I also have to say that the one of the things that Second Life did for me, and it really shook the foundations of everything that I had done for the previous 17 years or 18 years, was that it made me acutely aware that even our traditional models of health and wellness, the way that we view the human body, the way that we view what it means to be well, how we treat people who have a disease, dis-ease. I became aware, because of virtual worlds, that traditional model probably wasn't going to hold for very long. And it wasn't going to hold for very long, first because people had faster access to information, but that by having the tools to storytelling, that people felt more and more empowered to make value-based decisions on their own, rather than passing those value-based decisions on to a healthcare professional. Coming from the medical field, I became very aware that a lot of medicine, although supposedly based in evidence, a lot of it is actually about making a judgment call. And that the people that were making those judgment calls were traditionally clinicians, like a doctor or whatever. But that as we had access first to information and then to community, the third thing that we needed to make sense of our health and wellness was stories, because stories can help put all of that in context. So it's been really interesting to try to translate. At first it was just trying to translate what I had always done into virtual worlds, with success, I guess. But then second, to say, actually, what this is teaching me is that the traditional ways probably aren't going to hold for much longer, and that the thing that people are increasingly attracted to, think about issues related to aging. All of our traditional definitions of what it means to get older, I think, are being challenged. They're being challenged because the baby boom is a huge cohort. It's being challenged because we've seen our grandparents and or parents get older and be managed by the system rather than necessarily managing the system or managing their own wellness. And I think we have new expectations for what it means to grow older. And what is the role of technology going to be as we move into a nursing home, let's say? And so that's those questions about our beliefs, what it means to be wise, what it means to maintain connections across generations, are all things that we're kind of looking at as we continue our work in virtual worlds. And I'm kind of excited about where that's all headed.
Is there any particular, because I mean, obviously you've got like 20 plus years into this at this point. Are there any particular narratives or stories or experiences that you've had with inside these fields that you're particularly drawn to more than others?
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Well, how do I put this? Oh my goodness.
I guess I suppose I'll put it this way: is that I like dabbling in all kinds of forms of narrative. That's the way I'd put it. So I actually like, for example, I think L.A. Noire. I don't know if you've ever played L.A. Noire, but L.A. Noire is this big Xbox and PlayStation title, and it has something like 300 hours of content, and it's all based on kind of detective stories circa 1930 Los Angeles, and it was built by the guys who did Grand Theft Auto. So I love that kind of narrative because it actually has a very deep kind of I want to say almost a moral story. It actually had an almost moral story behind it, and I'm really fascinated with how what to an outsider might look initially just like a game with mechanics that look like a game, but that in fact it had an incredibly deep narrative structure. In Second Life, I'm fascinated by the concept of performance, because Second Life of many platforms, Second Life has this performance quality that I think is it's just amazing that people come in here and they can play different roles, they can express themselves directly, or they can express a different persona through their avatar. So all of these ideas about kind of identity fascinate me. Like, it really does fascinate me when a narrative asks you to kind of play a different, put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And then I guess I'm fascinated by the interplay between game mechanics. We were talking about this before the show, but that interplay between quote-unquote gamification or game elements and narrative, and trying to figure out how something that's quite structured and how something that's non-structured can sort of interplay with each other, and what that does to a user's perception of the digital space.
Yeah, because we were starting to discuss this whole idea in terms of the difference between the linearity of games in general versus the what was the term that I used before?
Almost organic, isn't it?
Yeah, organic. Because societies are a mixture of organic states of being, so to speak. So it's we don't necessarily get from point A to point B, although in some cases we should, by drawing a straight line. But you look at just about anybody's career path, and I defy most people to say that they ever went in a straight line to get from high school through to where it is they ended up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the biggest challenge for storytellers, and it's probably also the biggest beef that I have with this idea of transmedia, because I think the idea of transmedia is that these storytellers look at life online. So I'm a movie maker, let's say, or I'm making a TV show, and then I realize that there's all of this chaos that's happening online. So I put a TV show on, and then I said, what's going on? People aren't watching my TV show. They're spending more time blogging about it or posting comments on Facebook. I want to get a piece of that action. That action is the organic stuff that you're talking about. It's people riffing off of a particular character. It's creating fan fiction. It's creating things that don't fit into the producer's narrative. Transmedia proposes to those producers that, don't worry, we can tame this beast. We can create a production methodology, but just treat it like something that's kind of controlled, and it's just a bunch of levers that you need to turn in order to keep the narrative under control. And that's my beef with sort of the philosophy behind transmedia, because transmedia sort of is proposing that we can kind of build this uber structure to contain things that are they're going to be organic anyway. And so I think the challenge for storytellers is not to fall under the illusion that the story can be contained within this concept of transmedia, but to honor the fact that it is organic and that there is serendipity and that there's going to be two people who meet who have never met before around a story, and the story that those two people who meet can tell, the way that they can participate in the narrative, contribute, is something that you can't predict, and I'm not sure that you can always contain within a particular kind of infrastructure or Uber structure. So the challenge for the future storyteller is to have stuff that's planned out and to have some structure, but to recognize that probably the most important thing that's going to happen is going to happen in a way that you had never predicted. And that's the challenge that we're trying to tackle that challenge with Startled Cat, and certainly are inspired by virtual worlds like Second Life and OpenSim, because people who are here already know that, and so we can continue to learn from these people who recognize that narrative is organic. And the more that we can learn from each other, I think the more that we can take these principles out to, the kind of wider world.
So, I mean, in terms of this, because I want to link a couple of concepts that we've talked about over the last hour, because I think there's something here that I want to sort of get at, and I sort of need to talk this out a little bit myself here. But there's this mentality that still seems to exist inside the broader multinational corporate culture that basically says everything needs to be owned. But yet, when you have an Internet of Things, and where the as we were talking about, the commoditization of social connection and social communication, and to a certain extent, the value of certain things around us. I mean, that it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a command and control structure. It tends to lend itself more towards what you were referring to in one of your blogs, more of a democratic type process. And I'm wondering whether or not this is one of these types of paradigm shifts that you see the storytelling from what we're doing within here is eventually maybe going to be leading us to down the road.
I think we're at a turning point, and this was, I'll circle back to my thing about Kevin Kelly's book, which, I've probably drafted a book's worth response, because it really kind of shook me. They say, this kind of belief that the beast can be tamed again, the genie can be put back in the bottle, because technology has its own designs, and technology is the thing that has control and not us. And or that was my way, I guess, of interpreting it. So I think we're at a turning point, because I don't think that pressure of corporations to own more and more of our story spaces is stopping. I don't think it should be. I don't think it should entirely be stopped. I think that it's a good sign that I think it's a good sign that there is a desire by corporations to meet us where we are, which is in digital spaces. But at the same time, I think there's a danger through whether it's government policy, the kind of information that we give up about ourselves to the internet, the kind of discourse that happens in public about everything from WikiLeaks to the Google Plus identity discussion. So I think we're kind of at a turning point where there is a danger that, there's this one meme out there that we're in the era of big data, and we're talking about not terabytes but exabytes of data about us, and that marketers are being offered the opportunity to use behavioral analysis and deep data mining in order to figure out what your patterns of purchases over the last 3 months online mean about what you might want to purchase next. And I think it's important that we at least acknowledge that that's happening, that corporations are trying to kind of take back some of the things that have been very democratic and all about our own ability to participate at an equal level with each other, and and to use tools, and there's lots of tools. One of the tools that we're excited about is digital storytelling, to make sure that we keep talking about, things that we may feel like we can't influence or don't have a stake in, but I personally believe that I guess we do.
Just before we go on, I want, if you could just double check your sound in world. I'm just getting a whole pile of messages floating by me that's saying your voice is off.
Oh, I'm back. Hello.
There we go. Excellent.
Sorry, everybody. I said something really dramatic and important. You'll have to watch the archives. Push up the ratings to see what I said.
Exactly. We have it on tape, so everybody can watch it
Good.
a bit later. Having that little bit of a break, I've got a couple of other sort of less intense type questions here. I mean, out of all the bits and pieces that you've done between all the different marketing groups and everything else, if you had just one story that you could tell, what would that story be?
You mean like of a project or of a?
No, just if you were told that you could only tell one more story.
Oh.
Right? What would that story be? What would you?
That's like saying, who are you as a human, and could you please answer in the next 20 seconds?
Yeah, and in 50 words or less, if you would, please. Yeah.
Wow. I guess there's a couple. I'm going to give you kind of two. I mean, one story is the work that we're doing with the military amputee community, and understanding what felt like you were kind of removed from creating stuff in Second Life, and it's a build, and you're trying to have a concrete outcome, and then really thinking about, this is a use case where the story I would like to tell is that we can be using these tools to have, I think, really, really profound impacts on people's lives. And I think everybody that's in the audience knows that. And so one of the stories I would tell is that, no matter where you are, no matter what basement you're in, or no matter what country you're in, the story I would want to tell is that our ability to create, my belief is that our ability to create is actually a spiritual gift. And that ability to create can have a profound impact on the world, no matter how small that creation might seem. But the second story I guess I would tell is the story of my nephew, who's 3 years old, and the experience of being with him with something that I've been involved in, at least involved in creating. And the experience of sitting beside a 3-year-old who's using a simple piece of technology to hear a story, and having some faith in the future of humanity by the fact that his eyes were still wide open.
And no caffeine and no coffee and no hot chocolate.
No, I gave him an espresso right before. Yeah, a 3-year-old espresso. It's good. It's good. I highly recommend it.
No, that's actually kind of cool. I mean, it's so interesting the way in which kids. I mean, especially kids. In that really interesting. And I know not all parents necessarily see it this way, but that very interesting 3 years to 6 years of age, where I mean, it just. It just comes out of them, whether they should be saying it or not. And I mean, it's just sometimes they just nail the truth of what is really important in life, just sort of bang on type of thing. That
I'd like to know though why kids like crawling over my head. What kind of truth is that? They just like crawling all over my head, and I don't know what kind of truth that says about me. But maybe I shouldn't ask the question.
I think all kids of that age like to do that.
I don't know, something about my head in particular.
Anything about getting their feet off the ground, they're quite happy with.
Good.
I've got another question that I've just been dying to ask, and feel free to avoid this in every which way you feel that you'd like to. both Metanomics and your own blog have been suspiciously silent of the last couple of months, and it just seems so unlike you, because I know how quiet and meek and demure that you really are in real life. And so what I'm wondering about is this the calm before the storm, and should we be expecting to see a new direction for Dusan Writer burst forth before the year is out?
I think you should, absolutely. There's no question. Yes. Yes, it may not actually. I've actually been working on something that I can't actually decide whether to launch it on the Dusan Writer domain or whether to launch it separately. And well, you'll know more in the next month or so. But it's been kind of my summer little project, and I'm excited to kind of get some feedback. Metanomics, certainly Metanomics will continue. It used to be a weekly series, as you know, it's going to continue. I just don't think we're going to do it with the same frequency for a whole bunch of reasons. Rob Bloomfield, who was our host, as you know, has almost. It seems like he has an almost unbearable level of commitments right now. So, but certainly we're going to continue with. I was saying this to you before I was saying this probably to Mal, is that Metanomics should always be there, because I think the community has given us a gift, and it would be a shame to not continue to honor the gift that the community gave us in participating with Metanomics.
Cool, very, very cool. I have one last question for you, and then we'll sort of wrap this up, and I'll let Rob sort of sign us off afterwards. If you had a crystal ball, what do you think the impacts of virtual worlds will be on society in 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, I think the impacts have already been profound, but 5 to 10 years from now, I think that we can expect virtual worlds to become. I think the concept of the avatar. It was interesting because I was giving a presentation this week to a group of people, some of whom had never really been in a virtual world. They kind of knew the term. Some of them had been, and I could tell you, if I had given that presentation 4 years ago, there would have been sort of eye rolling and questions about what the heck is an avatar? Why do you have a cartoon character? And certainly that's changed, and I think it's changed forever. The concept of being somebody else in a digital space is just now an accepted cultural convention. So I think certainly the idea of digital virtual spaces where storytelling happens is here forever. I think they've already had a profound impact on the world, both in redefining the way that we are entertained, and for many individuals, it's changed their perspectives, it's changed their awareness, it's made them more appreciative of how things are created. They've been able to explore themselves. Just so many ways. I think over in the 5 to 10 year horizon, I think that virtuality will become embedded in reality. And I don't just mean augmented reality, but I kind of mean a sense that virtual worlds are going to have more of a direct impact on physical environments, and we'll start to see the concept of being in a physical space that has digital overlays and windows into other environments where you're talking to people that might be at a distance, and that we will be able to, it will be not be uncommon for people to show up at work as an avatar proxy, and so I think the impact will continue to be profound, and what we look for, I guess, is those next great stories, because I think we've discovered, for example, that video games, for example, can create stories that are as good as, if not better than, many movies, and I think virtual worlds have discovered that same capacity for art, and I think we'll continue to look for and try to create and participate in these shared narratives, because they're important. It's not just that we're here to have fun, but this is an important way of kind of grappling with what technology means for our shared futures and for humanity and for culture and society. So being here, I think, to me, being here is important, not just to have, because we're exploring the limits of where the human imagination can take us.
Very good. Well, Dusan, I'd like to thank you very much for coming and sharing an hour with us. That's all the time we have available for the broadcast show. But there's obviously been a ton of questions inside the local chat here, so I'd like to invite you to stay for an after-show wrap-up after we're done. And like I said, it's been wonderful having you on the show, and looking forward to good things to come.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Great. So just to sign off here, that's it from the Rockcliffe Rotunda. I'd just like to let everybody know that we have, and hopefully I'm going to pronounce the name correctly, Terry Bobois, or AKA Tab Scott, who is the director of the Creative Research Lab in the College of Art and Architecture at Montana State University. He's going to be our guest on September 28th. Inside the Avatar Studio is produced by Bevan Whitfield and Rockcliffe University Consortium. Technical production by Robustus Hacks and Mel Burns in association with Metaverse TV. For more information on Inside the Avatar Studio, please check out our website at urockcliffe.com, 2 F's, not 1, or subscribe to our Twitter or Facebook fan page at urockcliffe. So again, thank you all very much, and that's it from the Rockcliffe Rotunda.